Good day, Brigade. This is Bobby coming at you with, honestly, we've been kind of busy this past couple weeks, like really busy working and all that. So we're gonna be more of an audible on this one and kind of give some of our thoughts and ideas on some current events going on. Anyways, before we get into all that, gonna have a little fact for you, and quite frankly, a rather interesting one. One that I just learned about myself. Did you know that only one president spoke English as a second language? And that president was Martin Van Buren of the Whig Party. He did not speak English, he actually spoke Dutch growing up in Kinderhook, New York, which actually isn't that uncommon, at least back then, because if you're unfamiliar, New York, the city, actually used to be a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam. It was later given to the English through a variety of fun little politics that happened around that time. We're not going to go into detail on that now. But, yeah, in fact, it was very common in the United States up until World War I even for people to not speak English as their primary language, especially in the Midwest and in upstate New York and Pennsylvania. Why? Because the First Amendment, A, was a thing. So freedom of speech even included the right to choose what language you wanted to speak, just as much as what you wanted to say, so long as what you say does not present a false, clear, and present danger. And for a while, that was the case. In fact, a lot of people in upstate New York and Pennsylvania still speak Dutch. A lot of people throughout the states of Iowa and most of the Midwest still speak German to some extent, and you can still find that German heritage alive and well today. Anyways, let's get on with some fun. So, as we stated previously, we're basically going to be covering over some current events over the past couple weeks because, well, one, we don't really have much of an outline right now, and two, we're kind of at that point right now, at least electorally speaking, where most of what you're going to see has already been said and done. Most of the debates have been taken care of. A lot of people have already begun voting early, which is an option in a lot of states. However, there are also a lot of other states that have tried to further restrict voting. For example, recently in Georgia, there's been a lot of trouble with early voting and all that due to their radical changes in election law and the fact that any Georgia citizen could, quote, challenge one's electoral validity. In other words, you can have a challenge issued on you by someone you probably never met before in your life over whether or not you are eligible to vote. Which, A, how is that not beyond fucked up? B, definitely deters a lot of people from voting. And C, isn't very democratic when you think about it. Now, they have said that individuals can fill out a provisional ballot before they actually can follow through and fill out their challenge and all that, which, A, they shouldn't have to prove their own fucking viability. That's kind of what they did when they registered to vote. And if you didn't check that information as they registered, well, I feel like that's an issue of the state, not an issue of the person. And the state should probably be doing a better job at that and not imposing laws that make it harder for people in general, but rather maybe put some greater scrutiny on the state itself. But God forbid we blame the state when we can easily blame the individual. Anywho, this provisional ballot that you can do would basically just be a ballot that isn't really getting counted until you can prove your eligibility again. Which, again, you shouldn't have to. That's why you registered in the first place. And, even so, no one should be required to fill out a provisional ballot. What, are you going to challenge their ballot based on their political views, based on how they vote? Because there's no way to guarantee you're not looking at that provisional ballot. There's no guarantee that you won't deny people the right to vote simply because you don't like who or what they would vote for. Especially with this provisional ballot and the fact that any Georgia citizen can challenge any other Georgia citizen's validity and eligibility to vote. And they don't even have to know each other. So when you consider the provisional ballot in addition to this, you kind of have to question whether or not, as of current, the rules that exist on this are even viable for an electoral system. And I get it. You want to make it so that it's easier to scrutinize and make sure that your voter rolls are up to date and all that. At very least, that's what you claim. So we're going to take your claim at face value. How does this help? How does this make it easier and more secure for individuals to vote and not just create a system in which you can discount or disqualify someone's vote just based on opposing viewpoint? For one, no Georgia citizen should be able to challenge any other Georgia citizen's right to eligibility. That should be a matter for the actual goddamn office that handles that, which I believe would be the Secretary of State. However, I'm not certain because I do not know the specifics beyond most recent laws for elections in Georgia. Because, unfortunately, not a Georgia citizen, but typically, it's handled by the Secretary of State. So, Georgia, how can we be sure that you're going to do this correctly and properly and not just pick one particular political side because you were astonished that the last time an election came around, you didn't exactly vote the way you expected to vote? In this case, I'm saying the government didn't expect for the state to vote the way that it did. And in fact, the government took many measures up from 2020 up until now even to try to limit the ability for people to vote. They tried to limit the number of days individuals can vote overall, the limited means by which people can vote, and all that. Which, again, there are valid concerns towards that. For example, voting machines, while they're pretty great and impressive pieces of technology, are not flawless. And that makes sense because nothing truly is. But to say that just because it's not flawless doesn't mean we should use it ever, and that it would create less fair and equal elections, is just patently false. In fact, we found that while it's not perfect, it does better than paper ballots, because it allows for voting to be conducted faster, more effectively, far more efficiently, and, as we've proven at least so far, elections are still pretty damn secure, if not the most secure they've ever been. In fact, the number of fraudulent votes is not even breaking over a few hundred. And this is talking about over the entire country, over every single ballot, every single vote, on any given race. Go ahead. Look it up. It won't even break 1,000 on any year. Which suggests that maybe voter fraud isn't a real problem, but rather people are looking for valid excuses, or what they consider valid excuses, to disenfranchise others from voting. This would not be surprising. However, if Republicans really wanted to improve their chances, instead of trying to fight for broken electoral systems and create a system that's inherently unfair to others, they might want to consider something like ranked choice or consensus voting, or even multi-mixed proportional system, if I remember that correctly. MMP. It's weird. But it's basically a voting system that requires political parties, but you vote for political parties, but not individuals. It's a whole mess. Anyway, there are plenty of other options that are still fair and valid election methods that would still give you a viable chance against your opposition party. And if you choose something like consensus or ranked choice voting, you even give the opportunity for third parties and other parties that might be more willing to agree with you or coalition with you to jump into Congress, and while you may no longer be able to hold a majority per se, you are guaranteed to at very least have the opportunity to have allies that you can convince over much more easily than if you were trying to convince people of a opposing party within a two-party system. This is why multi-party politics works more effectively. Now, in an immediate spit in the face of that, Italy has gotten a new prime minister. A radical right-wing prime minister. In fact, probably their most radical right-wing prime minister since Benito Mussolini. That's how crazy we're going here. But, again, this should also be noted, this Prime Minister of Italy is at least trying to seem like not an incredibly appalling person-ish. They've already said they're not going to work with Russia until this whole Ukraine fiasco is taken care of. Great. They're currently trying to focus on improving the life of the average Italian. Good? I don't know. It's still a bit early to tell with this government. But keep in mind, it's already got a big strike against it. You know, for being radical, right-wing, borderline fascist. Think of it like fascism light. So, yeah, that's happening over in international news, and kind of an example of when a multi-party system isn't necessarily perfect. But again, we don't have to be like Italy. Nobody should be like Italy when it comes to politics. Seriously, at one point in the mid-2000s, the average person had probably about a 40% chance of becoming prime minister, assuming they even involved themselves in politics. Where the statistic comes from, straight out our own ass, but look at Italian politics and see how many governments they formed between the years 1991 and 2011. That should tell you enough. Speaking of prime ministers in rotating office, Britain has gotten rid of their prime minister, Liz Truss, 44 days! New record! And replaced her with Rishi Sunak, the first Indian-British British Prime Minister. Look, there's no way to say this politely. At least not that we can think of. He's the first Prime Minister not from England. Or rather, no, that's not accurate either. He's the first Prime Minister of Indian descent in the United Kingdom. There we go. And, well, he definitely is on the more right wing of things because he was a Conservative MP who was chosen by the Conservative Party since they technically still have the right to form a government, at least for another couple years. And they're going down the shitter pretty fast, so they're going to need somebody. And they chose Rishi Sunak. Now, there's a good reason why they did choose Rishi, because Rishi is, how you say, the, quote, common sense politician. Now, you might be wondering, why did we quote that? And there's actually an answer to that. It's the idea of the, quote, common sense politician. What is the common sense politician? Well, the common sense politician is an idea that a politician tries to sell themselves as in order to try to appeal to a broad base of support without necessarily having to tap into populism. It's basically putting a wink and a nod towards the idea of populism without necessarily having to go forward with any populist beliefs or things like that, and basically give yourself the idea of defending the interests of the people. Now, you might be wondering, okay, now where's the common sense part come in? See, there's the kicker. A populist argument is usually greatest when you can show that it appeals to basic common sense. The average person likes common sense, at least as an idea. Not that they practice it, dear God. But as an idea, the average Joe likes the idea of common sense. So if you sell yourself as the common sense politician, you're kind of selling yourself as the, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, I'm not the greatest guy in the room, but I'm going to be the guy who sits in the room and actually thinks about shit rather than shouting off whatever the hell I want. Or whatever the hell the party wants, or what have you. Now this is where it kind of gets into is the common sense politician actually a common sense politician? And that's where it kind of gets mixed, and it really depends on the individual you have as a politician who's doing so. In the American Union, Anyone who sells themselves as a common sense politician, they're just appealing to the broad base of average people. How do we know this? Because both parties do it, and they do it like crazy. I'm the common sense politician, I'm the common sense. That's kind of why we were willing to put it in quotes in the first place, actually. So, that's what's going on there. Will Sunak be able to actually save the English government from total collapse and economic destruction? I don't think he won't. I don't really think he has much of a good chance, but it's really not so much he's going to be able to do it or not do it by his own policies, but rather little Britannia's out to sea right now on her own. And there was a reason the European Union was kind of necessary. And it's kind of making shit a lot harder on Britain. So, for those of you who may not know, the European Union is the biggest asterisk of trade and economic and social deals ever. It's kind of a confederation, kind of not. It's kind of a federation, kind of not. It's kind of a supranational organization, kind of not. It's basically if you were to take Europe and make it a country, but not really a country, so, you know, Europe. It's realistically a whole freaking quasi-trade confederation that formed basically off of initial economic proposals between post-war Germany and France in order to help strengthen the European economy and continent against a communist invasion and threat. Now, the European Union actually was largely there to rebuild things more or less, rather than be a military alliance. That's what NATO was for. So, eventually, the European Economic Cooperative Council and a bunch of other European economic agreements and shit formed and coalesced together into the big old treaty of the European Union. And it turns out there was a good reason for all that. Because now Europe's integrated as hell. It's almost its own independent nation. Almost. It has a governing body, which resolutions are binding. Member states can leave, as Britain has proven. But it's also not necessarily a great idea, like Britain has proven. And, well, that's kind of the big kicker is, while it is possible for Britain to come out of this alive, there's not a solution that gets Britain stronger out of this. They can't exactly work on their own because they don't have the economic power they used to. Like, I'm not even talking back when they were the British Empire. I'm talking back in the early days of the Commonwealth, like in the 60s and 70s. They do not have the economic power they used to back then. And their power seems to be further devolving with each day that passes. In other words, they may have been able to make it on their own at one point, but the geopolitical stage has shifted so dramatically since then, Britain has largely just been subsumed into the overall category of Europe. So while Britain might try to be an independent powerhouse and all that, it's going to be very similar to how France bailed on NATO. Except for instead of militarily slowing them down, it's going to economically slow them down. So, will Sunak be able to do something? I do believe he has a good chance of being able to stabilize the British economy. I don't believe he'll be able to grow it, expand it, or improve it in a way that would be significant without it being forced to rejoin the European Union. And I don't see them rejoining the European Union without some sort of, punishment. Slap on the wrist. Gib smack. For those of you who may not know, Gib smack is an idea we kind of borrowed from a show called NCIS, where a character, Jethro Gibbs, smacks people in the back of the head lightly when they do something stupid. So yeah, we don't expect Britain to come back in the European Union without one. And honestly, we don't see Britain's economic prospects improving anytime soon, especially since the European Union still exists, and they would probably be the greatest economic competitor. Which, oh my god, Britain stands no chance! So, our last little bit of news today jumps into the whole Twitter Elon Musk debacle fiasco, and more on some analytical data that Twitter has found. Twitter has recently found that their heavy tweeters, the people that basically rely on for ad revenue and all that, the people who are on there a lot, like 6-7 days a week, and post at least 3 or 4 times a week, this is their parameters, by the way, is declining seriously. And the topics that interest people most throughout the pandemic, like politics and all that stuff, is giving way to 2 very difficult categories to sell ads for, which are cryptocurrency, which, honestly, that does well when it's a good day, but does terribly when it's a bad day. Like, seriously, it's kind of like watching... It's the economic equivalent of a bipolar individual, and it's really, really bizarre. When it's up, it is up. But when it's down, ooh boy. But that's one of those categories which, as it loses interest quickly because people are panicking in it, it's going to disappear off the news radar. But the other one is not safe for work content. This can be a broad category that covers things from pornography to just basic nudity to all sorts of fun stuff. I'm pretty sure you probably used an NSFW badge at one point. That would be the stuff that falls under this category, which advertisers are already pretty iffy about advertising for in the first place. Add in the controversial platform aspects of Twitter to it, and yeah, most people aren't going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Or a 12-meter pole if you're European. Yes, I realize 12-meter pole is probably going to be a bit bigger than a 10-foot pole, but still. So, even if Elon Musk does buy it at the initial deal, Musk is going to be facing a very serious problem, which is the people that are most reliant on for ad revenue for Twitter are dropping off like flies. Where are they going? Who can say? Maybe they're not going anywhere. Maybe they're going to the original social media of outside. Which, after 2 years of being stuck inside during a pandemic and having to deal with all that stuff and probably being on your computer constantly, I'm sure most people are probably along the lines of, yeah, let's spend a few minutes outside. But it could be that they're going to competitor Facebook/Meta, because Zuck is starting to have a moment of truth there. Starting to realize what he wants to do and what needs to be done are 2 different things. But here's an interesting tidbit for you. Here's an interesting thought. And this is something we proposed a long time ago, back when Trump was actually first deplatformed. But here's what we propose. What if not just social media, but the entirety of the internet was, quote, internationalized? Now, the individual details of this would have to be worked out and hammered out, but basically, the internet would, in theory, belong to the Creative Commons of man. Anyone could pop a website up on there if they wanted to, and they'd have to be responsible for that website and all the shit that happens. But the internet as a whole belongs to all. Now, this is already true. Here's the second part. internationalizing social media. Now, what would this entail? Well, first and foremost, social media companies would be ended. Twitter would no longer be a private company. Facebook Meta would no longer be a private company. All these things would no longer be private companies. It's unsustainable. It doesn't work. It can't work. There's too many issues at hand, partly dealing with liability, partly dealing with limitation of speech, partly dealing with all sorts of crap. But this is kind of why social media is such a goddamn painful-ass leviathan. Because, as we've seen very clearly, if one individual has control or a strong enough influence or anything like that, they can cause some serious trouble very quickly. So this is why any private individual or private hands holding social media would fundamentally be a problem. Because who's not to say they're not going to just work it to suit their interest? In fact, that would be wholly expected for them. So, what would it mean to internationalize social media? First and foremost, and this is the most important step, each individual would be legally responsible and accountable for everything that they post on their social media accounts. Now, this could be concerning because there's hackers and all that about, but that's part of the reason why we have to improve cybersecurity and need to work on it on an international level. Because, well, the internet's a wild west. At this point, it's going to need some organization to it. But we have to play with organization that makes sense. So, for this, social media would have to have standardized rules. There would have to be specific sets of social media rules that would have to be worked out by everyone in the international community. Now, you might be thinking, well, then in that case, nothing's ever going to get done and this thing's never going to happen. But that's not necessarily the case. For example, the entire world managed to pretty much condemn chemical weapons. There's still a couple states that are still okay with it, and we know who they are. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, Bashir al-Assad beat with a stick. But it shows that historically international cooperation on things that we all genuinely agree need to be dealt with can happen. It can be done, it can be dealt with, it can be addressed. But once we make everyone responsible for their social media accounts, those are the individuals who'd be held accountable for what is said. Because it wouldn't make sense to punish Facebook or Twitter or whoever for what someone said on a platform that they merely provided under a contractual agreement. Now, if they don't follow Facebook's terms of services and privacy policy and all that, then it makes sense that they'd be deplatformed and all that. That's a good start. The thing is, you can't have a private individual control this, because a private individual will very clearly use it for their own biases and needs, which is why we believe the entire international community would be essential, because while they would still have biases and desires and want to push it to their particular way, the other powers should be a sufficient counterbalance to at very least make it so that some form of balance does exist, and at least something can be started. Further, if we were to add into this aspect that content that appears popular and all that is determined by the individuals who vote on it and the people who are within the social media, then what's most relevant and interesting to people will rise towards the top. This will not do much to try to curb misinformation or anything. However, it does allow for a step to begin towards verification by making the story known in the first place. As a story starts to gain in popularity, then it must be necessary for verification checks to be put into place to ensure that what is passing through people's inboxes and all that is actually real, valid, and true. All three of these things being necessary. So, from there, it's kind of like a sort of media democracy. Because individuals would get to vote up content and all that stuff, but at the same time, this voted up content would be subject to constant scrutinization and verification. So, what do now? Well, one of the benefits for internationalizing the internet, or at least in this case social media, would be that you could effectively eliminate advertising. Now, there would still have to be some sort of contractual agreement and all that, and honestly, I think just by virtue of being a citizen of the world, you should automatically have the right to access this information freely. There'll be people who will argue that and all that, and maybe you'd have to pay like a small tax or something to keep the things running and all that, but that would be up to the individual nations that question. But once you have this social media internationalization set in place, while it wouldn't be a perfect system, it would definitely be better than the one that is in place now, would take the accountability off of individuals who haven't really done anything, i.e. the soapbox providers, i.e. Facebook and Twitter, and put the responsibility on the individual who actually did, by holding them accountable for what is on their social media platform. Because you shouldn't have to go after you shouldn't have to go after the soapbox maker for giving the soapbox to the individual who said the stupid shit to cause problems in the first place. You should probably go after the individual who's causing problems. This would allow for that. The way we currently have it, neither the person who says the shit nor is the soapbox provider held accountable, and some people would like to hold the soapbox provider accountable even though that is completely unjustified. At the same time though, maybe the means to soapbox production should be owned by everyone, and not just by a few individuals, who can control what is heard and what is seen and what is posted. And rather, the people as a whole should probably decide that. With, of course, constant checks for verification and all that can be done by modern AI and such. Anyways, that's our show here. It's a lot longer than we expected, but at the same time, I think we got a little bit of what we wanted to cover all around in there. And, well, honestly, this has kind of been one of our more interesting episodes. Like it, hate it, regardless, share it, comment, let us know your thoughts on this particular style. And we've got exactly 2 more episodes before we go for a season finale. Or 1 more episode. 2 more episodes. 2 more episodes, yeah. Anyways, have a great night, pleasant tomorrow, and those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step.